Here's today's project. Agfa Ambi-Silettes. One's labelled spare parts, the other two for service. This one, very musical. Something's rattling in that one. This one here, not so much. Shutter actually works. This one won't wind, won't fire. Certainly not happy. The lens mounts. Certainly doesn't want to mount. This one. Seems okay. Rangefinder not within a bull's roar. Neither's that one. So they've certainly got their problems. And this is the designated spare parts model. This is the earlier one. You can see from the type of finder it's got hiding under the covers here. However, I'll start with number 2 because it's got the interesting rattle, I think. This one neither winds nor fires, so we'll start with this one, I think. The rewind knob. I want to get the top cover off. The rewind knob just spins loose. There's a collar on the top of the body that holds the top cover down, and that is obviously loose. At this end, a pinhead screw there, which is reluctant to move. I'll need better tools. That didn't need much encouragement at all once I had the right spanner on it. Frame counter disc. The lever itself. These pieces and that collar. Okay. One screw on the top cover there. See if it moves. I think maybe we'd be being held up by something under the shoe. Let's investigate. I want to get this cover off, but it doesn't want to play the game. It's got to come off that way. Here we go. And underneath it, no screws. That was not the answer. What else could be holding it? I'll have to investigate. Is there a screw from underneath? Don't see anything in the cassette chamber. A mystery. Well, a little bit of investigation later. I've got the shutter off the front, 3 screws from the back held that, no problem. So, looking at this, you can see that the strap lug rises and falls with the cover at this end, but at this end, the strap lug is fixed to the camera body, not fixed to the top cover. So the cover has to lift up from this end and be lifted off over that lug. Of course it can't be lifted up over this end because it's catching on the threads of the rewind post up here. So that needs to be stretched back. Probably the top cover is slightly distorted and it doesn't want to lift off over here, but that's where it's got to go. I would say the camera's probably been dropped and the top cover's slightly distorted. That's it. One more thread and we're done. That's it. That lifts off and the top cover lifts off that way. Easy when you know how. Looking at the strap lug, it's certainly bent in, it's damaged. Now the distortion on that is probably enough to cause me my problem. Just means the camera's been dropped on its end at some stage. That's certainly a nuisance. Did I discover what the rattle was? Not really. Never mind. We're in and that's the main thing. Of course this one didn't wind or fire, did it? Oh, look at that. There's our rattle and there's why it's jammed. There's a washer loose here. It's come from somewhere. And doubtless that was jamming the mechanism up. Yep, that'll be it all right. And our spring, our return spring for the film advance here, looks to be broken. Or at least off the pin. Let's pull that off and have a look. Now, it might not be broken. No, that's fixed, that's okay. This is all jammed. This should all move freely and it doesn't. But that was our problem, that little thing there, that washer. Of course I've got to find out where that came from. I assume that it's part of the mechanism. And it's lucky I've got another one to compare it to. See if I can figure out where that appeared from. Everything is very stiff. This is the shutter release here. It doesn't want to move at all when I slide it up and down the body. So I think I'll remove the rangefinder first and see how we get on from there. You can see 3 screws holding this to the top cover. I doubt that there's a 4th. That's it, that lifts off by itself. This is the coupling here. It couples to the focus mechanism at the front of the camera, and you can see it swings this arm, and this arm in turn will move their rangefinder coupling at this point. That whole finder assembly, of course, has got frame lines for the various lenses, 50, 35 and 90. This spring round here is just the detent for the rewind. Certainly that's dry and needs to be lubricated. The film advance components here, I want to bend that thing straight for a start. And the sprocket, I presume the sprocket is driven from down at the base of the camera somewhere. The shutter release would fire. That should release the film advance, allowing that to move. It does, like that. That would also cock the shutter by rotating that thing. This is all very dry, it's all very sticky, all very reluctant to move. See if I can remove this rewind knob assembly first and clean that off. The screws aren't tight. Just awkward to get at being tucked under that spring. I unhook that spring. Not easily. Now this film advance up here, we've got this plate here that just holds down this cocking rack, for want of a better name. Let's see if we can get that off. Good, that's loose. If I take this plate off, I should be able to free up this whole piece. Now there's a spring here, return spring on that little latch. Take that off, take note of that. That's a bit rattly, a bit sticky too. Okay, these 3 screws should hold that guide on the top of the advance shaft. That screw's loose. That screw's loose. Not surprised by those 2, they're probably loose because that bracket's took a hit and was bent up. Does this piece lift off? It does. Does this piece lift off? It does. This piece should be held on by a single screw by the looks of it. There's the shutter release. Now that's very sticky. It may be bent. Does this cam lift off the top of the film advance here? Oh, it looks like it's almost staked on the top there. I'm not sure if it does or not. Doesn't want to move. We'll leave it there. I don't need it off. Rangefinder coupling, just looking at that to see if it requires any work. Moving very freely, I don't imagine that we do need to do anything with that. And this little thing here cocks the shutter, so it'll be supported by the shutter at the front. It's certainly quite rattly in here. Does that little screw do anything? Tight anyway, so we'll leave that there. Rewind at the base of the camera. That moves freely enough. And then latches into forward motion. Alright, I'll start cleaning some things up. Well, the cause of the rattle, I think we're onto it now. I think it was this guide bush that would have sat in here and guided that release. And here's the screw, and if I'm not mistaken, that washer belongs to that screw, and that screw would have passed through the bush and held that assembly together at that point. So our rattle was that screw in that bush rattling in the front here, and we were jammed because the washer was jammed up in the film advance at the top. But that's what that is for sure. Interesting. Alright, back to cleaning up. I'm going to remove the rangefinder coupling so I can remove this plate, because I may be able to see something to do with this sprocket at that point. I just need to make sure that there's nothing in there that should be lubricated and hasn't been. So this screw from the top is a pivot for that plate. If I can get it loose, yeah, it's coming loose. I'll take this arm off just because it's in my way. It's assuming it's going to come off because it, yeah, that's okay, that's off. Can I lift this arm out? I might be able to if I get that screw head off. Oh, we're out. Just in case of swinging it in the right direction. 4 screws. Notice the return spring here for that arm. these screws have lost their black paint, or at least that one has, which suggests that someone's been poking around in here at some time in the past. Four screws and a spring. Now will this plate lift out? It will. Good, and it just means I can see where this thing was located, and it's just sitting on a boss right there. There's no shaft running right through. I can see my sprocket here, and there's not much to see here. There's no congealed grease or anything like that I need to worry about. Not much there at all. This shutter release, this was the thing that didn't want to move properly. It's got a flat on one side. Is it bent? Doesn't appear to be. I'll give it a clean and see if it suddenly improves its behaviour. It might just be sticky with dried grease. Certainly got grease on it. That is quite stiff. The bush it's running through looks like aluminium, though it might be zinc plated something. I don't know why it feels so rough. No, it must be zinc plated something, I think. That I think I'll work on with a bit of Brasso, see if I can get that to run a bit smoother down there. Not really any marks on the shaft, it's quite strange. At least it'll fall under its own weight now. That's a good sign. Before you needed to actively push that up or down. I think that'll be alright. So our rewind is under here. I don't know how that leatherette's going to behave. It looks bad to me because it looks very thin and it looks very well stuck. This base plate, this leatherette's in quite a deep recess, so it's very difficult. I can't just scrape the scalpel blade in underneath it easily. There'll be a screw holding this plate down, probably one at each end, probably about here and here I would think. Well, the leatherette's not as thin as I'd feared, but it's certainly well stuck. I think I'm going to leave well enough alone there. I don't think I'm going to gain enough by delving in there to make it worth the possibility of causing a lot of damage. Well, I know you didn't get to see much of that, but all I did was take those pieces off, clean them, lubricate them, and put them back in place. Now if I get this plate on here correctly, there we go. There's our film advance, and our shutter release would be in this position normally because it would have been pushed back up by the action of this plate. You wind on, film advance is locked, you've moved one frame, press the shutter release, it releases the film advance mechanism again. Of course that shutter release would rise back up under the action of this piece, and you can wind on again. So the film advance is all good. All these components have been cleaned and lubricated, and basically that's the film advance mechanism dealt with. Next I've got to turn my attention to the shutter assembly. This was certainly the major problem here, was that bush had fallen, that screw had come out, the washer had jammed the film advance, and the screw and the bush were providing the rattle that we heard earlier. This shutter, I can cock it manually, but it doesn't want to release. Oh, it did that time, just to make a liar out of me. Very good. Okay. I couldn't get any joy out of that at all before. Regardless of that, I'm sure it needs servicing. There, it didn't close properly that time. It went okay on a faster speed. Let's try it on the 125th. Yeah, looks good. So the shutter needs to be serviced. That's the major problem there. I'm looking how I get into this. I know that I've got to lift this plate off in order to get into the front, and this ring is glued in place. So I'm going to have to apply some, probably some acetone under that and see if I can lift that ring off. It's not uncommon to see this ring quite damaged on Ambi-Silettes as people have pried it off. At the back here, I've obviously got to disconnect my flash connection here, remove these two screws here, that bush that was loose, the screw at the top, screw there, and remove those three screws from the plate. Possibly that shutter removes from the back of that housing. I'll know shortly. That's the loose screw and the wayward washer. Take the bush off. Remove that shutter release mechanism. There's a single screw here I hadn't counted on, and that's loose. So loose screws was the order of the day with this camera. These screws, both loose. This one loose as well. So loose screws was the primary cause of failure here, and the shutter removes from the housing. I don't need to disassemble that front section, and that flash contact, I didn't even need to unsolder that because it was such a crappy solder joint that it just came apart. This little cranked arm here is our rangefinder coupling. That little cover plate. And I'm checking the feel of this to see if it feels rough. It may not be worth delving into that. I can see it's held together with three screws from the front underneath that plate. We'll deal with that later. Mostly I'm interested in dealing with the shutter. And the shutter is looking at the blades. It's got 6 blades. This is very much like the shutter from a Retina 3S rangefinder camera. So, into the shutter.